I get it. So I'm sharing a reference with everybody, which I can also dump in the chat if it makes it easier for you. And what I wanted to do was to look at some of the current thinking on paradigms of education in terms of developing our philosophies of, and now you need to tick your own box what you want: philosophies of education, philosophies of teaching, philosophies of learning. Are those the same things? Are they different things? So in other words, the paradigm in which you situate yourself versus the actions which you take and report on in your teaching portfolio. So just as a show of hands, how many of you have been to one of these professional learning series where we spoke about teaching portfolios, what you put in them, what you have to think about? Daniela and Nika, that's cool. So we've had quite a series. Some of them spoke about developing a philosophy, and some of them spoke about the technical tables and things, the information that you need to put in that. We're now calling it the yellow HR document, which is what they're calling a CV format, which encompasses part of your teaching portfolio. And it involves making a note of all the teaching that you do in terms of classes, hours, numbers, etc. And there is a little space there where they go, tell us your teaching philosophy. And then they move on to things like postgraduate supervision and a little bit of a space for curriculum innovation. That's kind of it. And what we're looking to do, Lizelle and I particularly thinking in different ways of working on it, is a way to make it fair for people to adjudicate those teaching portfolios. Because you know that when it comes to promotions, the research office has a rubric, basically, against which they measure somebody's research portfolio. So they'll say, for example, how many articles do you have published in ISI journals? And not only that, how many of those are original research articles, and how many of them are commentaries, and how many of them are case presentations, and et cetera, et cetera. So it matters what kind of journal article, and you get different ticks and lines on the rubric depending on what you have. And then they say, how many postgraduate students have you graduated? And yes, how many are you working with currently? Just to get a sense in terms of research of what that person does. So what we're looking to do is to take what HR is asking for with regard to the elements of your teaching portfolio, which very much speak to what you do and why you do it, and to develop some criteria that we feel would be fair enough to compare people across the faculty with regard to their teaching and learning. And one of the criteria that we loosely spoke about, and that's what resulted in today's professional learning, is that your teaching philosophy has to be aligned with your teaching practice. So if you tell me that you've thought about this deeply and you went away and did the PG dip, and you now feel that you are a facilitator of student learning and you develop learning opportunities, you don't give lectures, and your learning design is student-centered, and all the buzzwords that you can put into it. You tell me all of that as your philosophy, and then I go to look at your practice and I see that you teach 6 classes of 600 students, and you lecture them because that's what the timetable says you should be doing. And then you examine them using multiple choice questions. And that's what you do with regard to your undergraduate teaching. And with postgraduate teaching, you put all your students together and you facilitate workshops for them. Now, how do I say whether your portfolio of the things that you do and your report of your practice is congruent with your philosophy? Because it may well be that you have this philosophy, but you don't have any space in your department to bring in any kind of practice that would be your philosophy in action. Because I think that that's what most people complain about, is that doesn't matter how their thinking has changed, how their department does things usually dictates what it is they do. So let me just have a quick stop and check. As a hands up, how many people feel that they're in that situation? They have a philosophy that is different from what their department kind of, inverted commas, allows them to do. So Anne and Nico are saying yes, and Claire Ann as well. That's kind of cool. So can I ask you then, and we'll start with Anne because I know she's had lots of thinking about this. What is your philosophy? How do you think students learn and how we should be teaching? And then what happens in your context? What stops you from doing that?
So I'm do active teamwork, have fun while doing it. So I'm definitely pro-active learning and also very social constructivist. Like I love that. So I've been like trying to implement it into my steps, like my one screening program where I'm now having the third years shadowing the fourth years so they can learn from the fourth years, and I'm trying to encourage more like that environment. Like my biggest challenge has been like trying to work around the timetable. I must say I used my charm this year.
I'm happy to hear it.
And I managed to let the course coordinator last year allow me to restructure our fourth year's timetable, and we had no problems this year. So I'm hoping she'll trust me to do even more, and then eventually I'm hoping to charm the third year coordinator to let me restructure the timetable where it's not these little slots, but rather like these long, big slots that goes towards my subject, so that I can actually have like the full meaning day of creating interaction between the students and letting them learn more from each other and doing more useful stuff than just the damn lectures. Oh, excuse my language.
That does sound positive, yeah. So as a team, guys, if we were adjudicating this, where Anne says she's got this philosophy where students learn from each other, but originally the timetable didn't allow for it. So in the first iteration of her teaching portfolio, she would say, I believe students learn from each other, but there's no interaction between my students because there's no space on the timetable to do that. How would we score her? Would we say it's really nice you've got such a great philosophy, tick for the philosophy, and then I see you doing a lot of teaching, so tick for the teaching, and it doesn't matter if there's any connection between the two?
Very low score.
You're saying, but the challenge for us is to say, how would we score that? Because the truth is, you need to give kudos for having certain parts. That's part of it, is the technicist part of saying, is there actually a philosophy here? And how does that then tie in with the teaching? So the secret that I'm saying is what you're actually explained to us, Anne, that you looked at the problem and you thought, the way that I'm teaching at the moment is not congruent with my philosophy, therefore, how can I change it? And you started a program where you made one small change, and hopefully that will highlight your philosophy of teaching or learning. And now you're hoping to make more changes. And so what would connect your philosophy to your teaching practice is a reflective statement. So it's not just a philosophy we're looking for. We're looking for reflection on the evidence that you bring in your teaching portfolio. So you have a philosophy and you have a whole list of all the teaching that you do. And you also have, hopefully, some evidence or feedback on your teaching, whether that is from staff members or whether it's from the students, and why they want you to insert a self-reflection is because that self-reflection is supposed to tie the whole set together, the evidence with the philosophy, with the teaching practice.
That totally makes sense, and I think I might be in awe of things you say.
I know. So my suggestion, as we're going to work through this set of thinking about our teaching, is to say that when these HR documents are presented, it's fine, tick, 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 to have the 3 sections that are there on the document, which is the philosophy, the list of practice, and then the evidence of how well you teach. But the key ingredient will be the reflection that ties together those 3 parts of the portfolio. And I think, Lizelle, what we're going to have to work on then is developing criteria for the reflection so that we can say whether that reflection really does explain where the congruence is, but also where the disparity is between what your held philosophy is and what your actual practice is, or what the evidence is saying about your practice. Because we all know that you could be doing amazing practice, but if the students don't like it because they're not used to it, or because it was sprung on them, or because they didn't know whether it was for marks or not, and they give you a lousy review, you can embrace that review and say, this was just obviously a step too far for the students. It was too much dissonance. It's great practice and it fits in with my philosophy, but I'm going to have to introduce it to them in an easier way, or I'm going to have to let them practice with it a bit before I do another review, so that the students can see how beneficial it is for their learning. And so there are ways to incorporate how we report on what we report by tying them together. So Anna, you explained what your issue was, and maybe this concept of a reflection will make a difference. Nika, you do say you have a tiny little bit of leeway, but how does that not clash or not tie in your practice with your philosophy?
Hello, everybody. I hadn't prepared thoughts for this, so
no, that's fine. It's off the top of your head.
In my colours to the mast too hard, but I mean, I think it's interesting because I think we can do teaching that's fun and beneficial and empowering for students, but I also think we have to get them to certain standards. So yes. I'm an academic coordinator for GEMP 4 course, and I've got more control over that. I inherited some very old-fashioned activities and contents, and I'm gradually kind of revising them and putting them in more interesting forms in a way. But I'm also part of a department that teaches registrars, and that department, that teaching philosophy is flipped classroom and all very lovely and you know, empowering for the registrars, but they're not learning what they need to learn. You know, I think the problem with flipped classroom is they look to us for guidance of standards and they're not getting them consistently from the different consultants in the department. So I find that hugely concerning and frustrating, but it's not my area of responsibility, and people in my department are very kind of defensive and protective around their turf, and so I rock up for my turn when it comes along, but I can't influence that agenda, and I think it's not fair on our registrars. So I think there are 2 different problems. I mean, I think in the GEMP course, I can make very clear what standards they need to reach and help them reach it, give them tools to reach it, and then engage them in interesting discussions so their brains wake up for 2 weeks. And that's easy, partly because the standard's more reachable, and partly because they're also motivated, you know, it's a final year course. They just want to finish and get out, so they'll jump whatever hoops I say they have to jump. And so I've kind of made the hoops more fun and more engaging, and that's lovely. But you know, they're still learning what they have to learn. But I think with registrars, it's more complex. You know, it's a 4-year program. They get lots of different exposures, and the people in charge of it are not consistent across the kind of teaching and standard setting they get. So I think that's tricky. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. But it does show that you don't really have any the real say-so in the end, the autonomy to bring in the kind of change that you're looking for, to be congruent with the philosophy that you would put down. So here you are going for promotion, and you've done your PG dip, and you know lots of things, and you say, my eyes have been opened. In fact, the one phrase I found, which was mildly amusing, was the person had had an epistemological awakening in their teaching portfolio. So I was like, yes, good, I'm happy to hear that. But then what does that mean for their practice? And their practice was not reflective of that awakening. And so I think that in marshalling these 3 sections, which we have to work on in our teaching portfolio, which is that philosophy you talk about, the list of your practice, and the evidence of how it's gone over, developing a meaningful reflection, or maybe even a scaffold for the reflection, would be a useful thing for this group to do, so that when we come to adjudicating the reflection or adjudicating the bits of evidence, it's easier for us to say whether we feel that the person has been thoughtful about their teaching or not. Claire-Anne, you said that you also have an issue that your philosophy is not congruent with the way that your department allows you to teach.
I think your comment that you made earlier is probably more accurate than my department. I think that the students are quite resistant to taking on new ways. You know, I think particularly with COVID, there seems to have been a more panic learning than I've seen in the past, where everyone's kind of very particular about, is this remarks, you know, what do I have to do? And I'm seeing kind of a minimum requirement kind of philosophy coming through with some of the students as well, which is quite interesting. I don't think that it's permanent, and I think that we can shift it, but I do think that it needs to be something that we're more cognizant of.
Yeah.
Is the one side of it. And then the second side of it is we're in the process of presenting our first PG dip for sports and physiotherapy. And that's also quite interesting and shifting. It's an amalgamation from the Professional Society and WITS. And it's quite interesting having a lot of the physios who aren't involved in teaching kind of being quite resistant to new teaching methods. You know, they have this great concern that what we're teaching the students, if it's not exactly what they were taught, that it's not going to be of the same caliber. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting kind of path to walk, particularly after doing that 21st century learning. There were definitely some mind-blowing moments that were vastly different to what we've dealt with in the past. So interesting kind of so less departmental, more kind of external old physios and students who I found are very nervous of new ideas.
Sure. So it becomes even more complex then, because part of what we're going to adjudicate then is reflections on, yes, this kind of reflection, where are the holdups, where are the blocks to introducing that kind of teaching, and also where could we best put our energy and effort? Because if we're doing faculty development, like now, we're teaching people 21st century learning design, okay? And we have some real keen people, say 1 per department, who've done it, and they want to introduce it. Where are they going to find difficulty? And how are we going to keep the momentum of the thinking of those people compared to everyone else who really just, the students are saying, what do I need to do to pass? And everyone else is saying, is this the same standard as what we had 30 years ago? Because you're not asking the same question. So interesting. So I wanted to add to your thinking this afternoon. And the paper up on the screen is a paper that we've been using quite a lot in the recurriculation discussion for our undergraduate programs, particularly the Bachelor of Health Science and the MBBCH 1 and 2. and thinking about how we design our curricula so that our teaching is congruent with where we want it to be, and so that our graduates achieve the things we want them to achieve. And in doing that, so Lindsay Baker put together a series of ways of looking at education, which I think speaks very nicely to where we're coming from in terms of our real philosophies. And I thought it was just worth having a look at. So all I've done is taken the 5 paradigms or views that she's taken, and I thought we could have the discussion of where that kind of thinking is important in the kind of teaching we do, and how we could incorporate these different ways of thinking about teaching in developing a teaching portfolio. So it's quite nice to base your portfolio on literature that's extant, if you like, where we do have something written down about why it works, what it works. Has anybody seen this paper? Now, sorry, I know it's a lot of writing, but what I did was I just took the paragraph that described the paradigm, which, as I've said, they divided it into 5. And I know classically that this is not the way to present information, but I thought rather than you all having to go and download the paper and find the spot in the paper that I was reading from, we could just put it up on the screen. Now, classically, when we teach theories of learning, we talk about behaviorism as an old theory. And the idea in psychology of education that you can see learning has happened when there's a change in behavior is what this is actually based on. So they say right at the end that desired behaviors become habits, traits, or dispositions because they're reinforced by the way that we teach, and by the way that we assess, and by the way that we value things for learners. And it's quite interesting that I think most of us have this acceptance that even though it's the oldest theory, and there are plenty of others, and we talk about how people could move past the theories, it is the one that probably still describes our curriculum, the current way that we teach and assess in our faculty. So giving you a chance to have a look at this. Now I've lost my screen. You know what happens when you, yeah, my previous session definitely did close unexpectedly because I was looking for you guys. Okay, I'm back to my share screen. So as a matter of interest, and I will put it back up again, then it would be interesting for me to know how much you feel that behaviorist kind of learning does have value in the teaching that we currently do. Because I see what happens when people are asked to produce a philosophy. I think a lot of people just Google philosophy of learning, and whatever they find is they say, okay, the modern one is let's talk about constructivism, and then that is kind of what people have, you know, latched onto, and then they try and you know, they try and make what it is they're saying about it constructivist, rather than acknowledging up front that a lot of what we do, especially in health science teaching, has got a behaviorist background that definitely works for what it is that we want them to know. So some of the things are not valuable. For example, learners are considered blank slates, and learning involves acquiring correct information about the world. So there isn't that space, which is what we're encouraging, for experimentation, for problem solving, for trying and failing until students actually succeed. So perhaps it is a bit dated, but here they're saying, if, for example, there are things you want people to know really well how to do, without actually doing it a different way every time, and also to be able to do these things without thinking, but to do them correctly. And because this is a 2021 article, they talk about, for example, donning and doffing PPE. So when you come in and out of the ward, you want students to know the correct way to put on and to take off their protection and the consequences of where you put it and what has to be done with it. That is of necessity a change in behavior. You give them the information, they have to learn it, they have to demonstrate for you that they know how to do it, and that's their kind of advantage. And that is definitely behavioristic types of learning, and there's great value in that. So what I thought was, because there are 5 of them and we've got a few to get through, let's stop for a minute. Yeah, Daniela, so you're saying you thought of a patient consultation. How does that work in a behaviorist sense? Daniela, are you able to get to your microphone?
I can. Sorry, I'm walking around the house.
No, that's fine.
I'm just thinking about today. So why I said patient consultation? So we thinking about the patient-centeredness. So it's not just a consultation. I was teaching first years about how do you conduct a patient consultation so that you have rich information for a 3-stage assessment, a biopsychosocial. And we're talking about, so they were just asking family history and thinking on the biological model, they would only ask genetic predisposition. But if you want family orientated, I started having them think about, you need to ask how the family, what are their feelings around the illness? What they think could be causing the problem. It goes beyond just a family history of genetic predisposition, but how the family, how this illness sort of affects the family dynamics. And it's not just about support, but it's also knowing, what's their level of understanding about this pathology and what are some of the things that they could expect as the condition sort of, for example, complications of it, and possible stresses, as well as, even directing them that it's not just finding out what the patient's fears and concerns are about the illness, but what do they do about those fears? So I just thought of patient consultation because it's easy to say, no, it's just about taking a history.
Yes.
But with the way we try to teach our students, it's that you need to always keep in mind that it's not just the biological model. So you're not looking just signs and symptoms, but keep in mind that you thinking of the individual as well as their context. And even showing empathy. So I'm a big motivational interviewing advocate. So, how do you give affirmations? So some students struggle. So they don't know what to affirm and how to affirm. They don't know how to show that there's reflective learning, listening. So yeah, if I'm on the right trajectory, yeah.
No, absolutely. So the critique that Hodges gives, and that's our good friend Brian Hodges from the Wilson Center in Toronto, he says that it's not okay to say this is behaviorist kind of learning and it's important to be able to do it, because he says you then run a very fine line between a change in behavior because it's important to know automatically how to do something, and between societal control, between regulation of students, and between surveillance of students, which he calls counter to the ideals of education. So I'd be interested if people do choose behaviorism as their philosophy, saying, I'm just being honest, that's what we still do, whether they would be able to critique it in the light of thinking different ways of presenting the things that they do. So I would say that most people who have had that epistemological awakening wouldn't take this route. What they chose then, though, which is quite interesting, was cognitivism as an idea, which always has been the bridge between behaviorism and constructivism. So cognitivism in the sense that you can develop expertise, as opposed to constructivism, where you develop expertise. So if you had to adjudicate between people who said they were talking about cognitivism, which is the idea of information in, black box things going on, and then information out. It says learners are viewed as information processors, and teachers facilitate this processing through focused attention on how information is structured, organized, and retrieved. This is the area where cognitive load theory is important, where people talk about chunking data so that students learn it better, and where they talk about staged repetition as being important in the learning. So Lizelle, you'll be very tickled with this. I did meet with the Elsevier rep yesterday, who was trying to sell us lots of new products. And one of the things he said very enthusiastically was, and this product is based entirely on learning science, he said. And he was speaking about chunking and repetition, etc., etc. And I said, yeah, it speaks about cognitive load theory, but I would hardly call that the whole of learning science. He was very put out with me. He felt that, you know, once you've got a philosophy and you speak to that philosophy, then people must see the way that you're talking about it. So what I want to know is, here in terms of the cognitivist paradigm, where we're talking in medical training, a lot of people love the idea of cognitive load theory because the theory speaks about also scaffolding behaviors. So if you've got a procedure in the ward, or if you've got, you know, what's it called? Forgotten the word, but you know, where you have a flow chart of decision making. Help me out here. You know, they talk about guidelines.
Logic.
Yeah, so you've got guidelines for how to manage, say, type 2 diabetes in a child versus type 2 diabetes in an elderly overweight female, you know. So those kinds of guidelines are the things that assist people with managing cognitive load. Because instead of then having to learn every single fact, the guideline helps you ask the if-then questions that then chunk the information together so that it makes it easier for students to learn. But let's highlight this, the cognitivist idea versus the constructivist idea of expertise. And I think this is where you really have to see whether people understand what they're saying, the ontological and epistemological shift. So constructivism took a whole new approach to not only what knowledge is, but how we learn it. So if people are still talking about cognitive load theory and they're talking about chunking and repetition, they're still espousing the behaviorist idea that showing knowledge or performance of understanding is showing a change in behavior, and that students are blank slates that you now need to fill up, top up, you know, the banking theory, and the lecturer has the knowledge and it's possible to transfer that knowledge to students. That is still the paradigm that the cognitivist idea espouses. And if we look at constructivism, that's a whole new ballgame, right? Because in constructivism, what we're saying is prior knowledge is really important, and how students structure new knowledge depends on not only dissonance and discomfort with not knowing how it fits in, but trying different ways of fitting it in. So developing mastery learning by trying and failing, and developing expertise through cementing, and I love all these building metaphors, or constructing the knowledge in their own head. So the idea that in constructivism, knowledge is seen as absolutely dynamic. It's not something that you find between the covers of a big fat book. So Dewey spoke about adaptive expertise and developing expert practice. And how do we do that? Well, so I think what Daniela was saying was what they are doing in their history-taking exercise is role modeling for students how much more you can get and how much more meaningful that information would be if you looked at not only patients, but the history in a different way. And so that's where they come to here, saying that this paradigm emphasizes the learner in terms of the kind of knowledge that they actually espouse. But truthfully, constructivism as a different approach to learning was the perhaps turning point, the break from the behaviorist and cognitivist idea. But we kind of moved on from that quite fast, not moving on, but kind of building separately. Because if you look at the idea of expertise with constructivism, it moved on to what they're now calling constructivist interlocution. And that is social constructivism. So the idea of enculturation, the idea of modeling, the idea that you can learn not only from your teachers, so your facilitators, but you can also learn from peers. And here they've put it succinctly. The Vygotsky idea is that education is seen as a means to socialize learners. So socialize learners to be active participants in communities. So everybody participates and you learn from everyone, and you can actually teach other people within your paradigm. And that then starts to account for things like our workplace-based learning, our communities of practice, situated learning, all of those things where we talk about how learning happens from your environment and where learning can be shown by activity in the environment. So it's not just the straight constructivist idea, which was, yes, the idea of learning and education is completely different. But here they're saying constructivism, yes, is a psychological theory, but part of it has to be tied up into this idea that social learning is really important. I'm just going to whiz through the last two, because I think that that's the space where most people will feel comfortable to admit to in this third decade of the 21st century. And that is, oh gosh, this went even smaller. The paradigm that talks about humanism as self-actualization. So in other words, like Maslow in the hierarchy of needs spoke about this continuing upward trajectory of how people self-actualize. And this speaks to developing reflective practice amongst our students and assisting them, or again, scaffolding for them, the idea that they need to continuously self-evaluate and also self-regulate. And I think, so Claire Anne really referred to this a little bit earlier, is that our students can be very passive. They can be absolutely determined that not only will they do as little as it takes to pass, whatever that level is, but they certainly don't want to take responsibility for their own learning. So if there are 2 slides at the end of the pack that you didn't manage to cover, you will get a student putting up their hand saying, because we didn't cover these 2 slides, will they be in the test? And part of helping students to realize that self-actualization is important is in getting them to understand that this training that they're having now is really the first stepping stone in a long journey, and that if they don't develop self-regulated lifelong learning, then their professional journey is going to be a short one, because not only do they not learn everything at university, but they also need to know that their information will be out of date within 2 years of graduating. So whatever content they learned is probably moved on, and also the idea of how they learn needs to move on. So when people here learn by sitting in lectures, they start to learn differently when they're out there as graduates. And it's only then, perhaps at that point, that they start looking at YouTube and finding out that there's a huge range of quality in that. So then their regulation has to come into, how do they adjudicate the quality? And what do they take as learning and what don't they? So all of that speaks to this self-actualization paradigm where people start or should begin to become reflective practitioners and to self-regulate their learning, which I think is a step that we largely have not got to with our students yet, but it's certainly something to think about. And then the very end, the last one of the group that they talk about as an actual paradigm, and that is transformation. So learning as transformation and change agency. So here we use the right terminology. So we empower learners. And it's all about the axiological transformation of students. So axiology is about enculturating students in a paradigm that involves values. So ethical lenses, professional practice, ways of being in the workplace that we would like students to model. And that, although that does speak to enculturation, it speaks a lot more to the idea of developing that kind of yardstick or way of adjudicating where somebody is. And it works towards advocacy as well, because it's not okay to say, well, as we've always saying, we have electricity in our area, so it doesn't matter if other people don't have. One needs to be able to say overall, especially in a health systems approach, that if there is no running water, then in certain areas, then cholera can move throughout the whole town. It doesn't matter that where there is running water, people won't be spreading it. This is a bug that once it gets into the system can move throughout. So the idea that advocacy is really important, for example, as in looking at the social determinants of health, and that when we talk about transformation, we're not really talking about the individual transformation a la Mezirow. We're talking much more about the conscientization that Freer put out. And that speaks to lots of aspects of the training. The example that they pull out here is interprofessional education. Currently, we work in an incredibly hierarchical system. And how would one develop agency to change that system, not only from within, but with regard to the students? How do we teach students what professionalism is, and how do we show them how we adjudicate it? So all of those rubrics that say, did the student greet the patient? Was the student's attire correct? You know, all those little things that seem so easy to mark. Well, then how do we then accrue them together and speak about the paradigm of transformation to become? So being and becoming being the important verbs here, to become that healthcare professional. So I have thrown a huge amount of information at you, but my sense is that most of you have heard about these philosophies before. And here what's refreshing about them is they've worked them into paradigms. So they're speaking about learning in this context, and they're speaking about teaching in this context, and what it is that we do in order to identify with those contexts. And so I was hoping that the paper goes on, really. They give 2 case studies where they highlight the kinds of thinkings where these paradigms are important. And what they put forward is what they're calling a pluralistic approach, showing how your thinking changes depending on your context and how you can apply different paradigms to bring meaning to the kinds of teaching that you do and to the kinds of learning that you hope your students will be able to do. So the whole reason for looking at these paradigms at all, well, there are 2 reasons, I'd say. The first one is, Daniela, I'll get you now. The first one is about doing research. So how could we classify the questions that we're asking, and speaks to the paradigm. And the second one is about for example, the technicist thing that we spoke about now, which is crafting a teaching portfolio, and how do you align the kind of teaching that you're doing with this grand philosophy that we speak about in terms of how we think learning happens and what we need to do in order to help people learn. I'm tired of my voice, Daniela. Come into the conversation.
Thanks, Shira. This was really, really nice. I really enjoyed this.
Great.
So I wanted to ask, so I'll tell you where my frustration comes from, is that I think within what I've seen from the curriculum that's been designed by my colleagues, I think they are towards that transformation change agency, probably also because of our profession. We have to be advocating for ourselves, for our own professional identity, but also I think because where the students are recruited from, a lot are from urban, peri-urban. So already on recruiting the students, there's already something that they bring to the table that allows us to work towards within that paradigm. My thing is, and I like how you touched on the lack of interdisciplinary work, as well as the hierarchies that we have, is that, because I'm saying, to what end are we then teaching? And that's sometimes how I feel when I teach clinical associates. To what end? If we are having this teaching philosophy, but then they're practicing medicine in a system that doesn't share the same philosophy.
Yes.
To what end? And then they get supervised by practitioners that don't share the same philosophy. And so for us, I mean, we are very family orientated, family medicine kind of focus. But then the students go and they get supervised within this biomedical philosophy.
Right. Yeah.
And there's not much patient advocacy. So a perfect example, we've got first years. These are 6 months post-matric. They've taken a history. They've gotten to identify that there's this patient in the ward who has defaulted her antiretrovirals, and she's 8 weeks pregnant, and she's an inpatient, but no one's starting the antiretrovirals. And they want to do some form of patient advocacy, but they don't have the agency to speak to any of the clinical team within that hospital, because already it's, don't forget your place, right? You firstly are first year, we not necessarily part of that medical team, so we don't work in that hospital. So to then comment or give input on patient management when you haven't built a relationship with the staff, you're also walking around eggshells. So now here's this patient dilemma. There's serious, the system is failing someone in patient care, and you're teaching, students to be patient advocates.
Yes.
But you disempowered as the facilitator. So you walk away and you come back to main campus and it's just a discussion. So then you say, to what end? It's things where patient consultations are happening with no privacy. People are asked some very sensitive comments, and you teaching students, no, you need to give a trigger warning when you ask sensitive information, draw the curtain. But so here, to what end? This is what you're teaching. This is what they're observing.
It's
sometimes you strike,
lucky.
You find like-minded people, but I'm looking at this last paradigm and I'm saying, to what end, and what other tools, and what I don't know, I'm going to go look for this paper. How do you then find people that you can work with and make sure that we, the students, because sometimes students graduate and they say, yes, we love the health systems that you taught us. We love the medical ethics. We, did learn about patient advocacy, but I can't use any of this that I've been taught. And so, yeah, that was just my comments. The question is, to what end in such an environment?
Yeah, and I hear you completely. But in our healthcare system, which is a spiraling dysfunctional system, we need to start being starfishes, or at least rescuing starfishes. If we don't teach it, if we don't even initiate this kind of thinking, then the status quo prevails. Then people think it's okay to be in this hierarchical system where people don't think of patients as people, and where people don't imagine that facilities could change for even, basic privacy, etc. So I'm not saying we will manage to change things overnight, but I do think, especially when we start looking at health system science and ways of changing a generation of people involved in setting up hospitals and in policy making and in developing systems and improving systems within the healthcare sector, if we don't have this kind of thinking, then we're going to perpetuate the bad things completely without any of the good things. And so I'm for it. No matter how many people say, I loved learning this, but I can't use one shred of it, there will eventually be a groundswell of people who say, actually, why don't we make this one small change, and it will make a huge difference to the patients or to the staff or to the interprofessionality of what we're offering. So yeah, I'm happy to have these conversations, and I agree with you. I think we really need to be a little bit more active about it, to say, in terms of policy, WITS thinks that, for training in this facility, these are the bare minimum of things that we ought to have. And we should have that kind of clout. And I think that we don't have speaks to the fact that people have thought that other people will do this. And I think we've reached a point where we're realizing that they're not going to. And that we really do need to develop the advocacy profile of advocating for healthcare, patients, positivity in the system. Great. I see we're up to a 0-0. Nika, I did the slides are just lifted from the article just so that we could think about them individually, but I did post them there for you. And I dropped the article in the chat. I think it is thought-provoking for us to read about these things and also to talk about them. So today, because I was working straight off the back of Sahi, we didn't really have that in-depth chat. Maybe in future, what we can do is develop some small work groups, so that people can take their own philosophy and see how it resonates with the paradigms that Baker has put out, and how it is that we can start building this reflection so that we can make our information in the teaching portfolio more useful and more applicable. So it's a work in progress. Lizelle and I will be very happy to take your input in things that you think we should be looking at in terms of integrating your philosophy with your practice of teaching. Thanks for coming along, everyone. It's on a cold winter night with lots of load shedding happening. So I'm very happy that you took the time to drop in, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.